Hey everyone, so I lost my coconut piece of microphone. The reason is, and then I apologize about that, the sound on the last podcast wasn't very good. It's actually the coconut thing made it too close, and then as I breathed on it, I felt like there was the sound was an issue. So back to my normal setup. About the last podcast, I was asked a very good question, which was, what about the Q training versus the burner question? It seems to be the opposite. And yes, that's very astute. And they're not opposite, they're complementary. But yes, you're right in that sense that they are completely different things. And I'm going to use those two and Disney December to actually talk about the Q training some more, but also a very important conversation about mental health. Because at the end, that's what I feel the training that is Q training, burner question, Disney December, it's about behavior. I do not think we can split behavior and training. Like we talk about, training for performance all the time. Obviously, we all like to be either strong, conditioned, both running, marathon, powerlifting, strongman, jiu-jitsu, fighting, MMA, you name it, boxing. Right, all of it, I'm interested in all movements. Right now, I'm doing more toward what we call it power training. So power Q training, Q square, QN, Q to the power. So I think that's what I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it Q, to the power N training from, the power, what was called the power training of the 70s when the idea was to be very muscular and strong at the same time, which I still think it was not the golden age, but, one of the best type of training there was, an exploration toward all this. So where does behavior and all this fits into this? So this is an idea that was brought about by Karl Friston. Now, don't get me wrong, he's not the only one talking about it, right? But he brought it forward, was the embodied cognition. This has been something humans have been talking and discussing for hundreds of years. But this was a very important part that I think is sealed forward, is that idea that the brain is not a passive organ that receives information and from there analyzes them and from there give orders to the body in order to accomplish whatever was decided. If you look, maybe it's a Christian idea, but if you look, it's a Western, up till not so long ago, a Western way of looking at the brain, right? And I think, again, going back to Descartes, I think therefore I am, is an idea, and that's not necessarily what he meant, but I think that's an idea that was pushed forward on the philosophy side and on the medical world side, that the brain was, again, a passive organ. We receive information, we receive data, we receive, sensory input. The brain processes it, and from there that dictates to the body what's going to happen. And that's completely wrong. It turns out the brain is a Bayesian machine, which means it plays with percentages, not 0 or 1. If you look at the idea of the brain as a passive organ that receives information, it's a very much a 0 or 1 thing, a deterministic machine, right? Action creates reaction. Something happens, I react, and therefore. Turns out it's not that. Turns out it's a Bayesian machine, which means it's a constant game of probing, right? So it turns out that the brain does not receive data. Whenever data arrives, the first thing it does is it pokes against it to see what the reaction is going to be. And based on that reaction, it's going to adjust. And based on the adjustment, it's going to adjust again. So it's a play of hierarchies and always testing, observation versus prediction. So whenever a data comes in, the brain does not absorb it. The brain is actually going to predict against that sensory data and see if he's right about the prediction. Why predicting that? Because it's not enough for the brain to know what happens in the world, because that's too late from a predictive mechanism to ensure survival, right? To ensure survival, it's not enough to know that something is coming my way. I need to know why, because that prediction will allow me to do better. There's a sound in the back. I hope you can't hear it, because I do, but I hope it won't show on the audio. If it does, again, sorry, I'm outside of my house and it seems to be doing work in the back. So back to the sensory idea. And that's the foundation of embodied cognition, right? Is that the brain cannot just receive data. It's incapable of doing that. The brain is only capable of receiving data and trying to understand the causality of it, the why the data is there. So if it's hot, why is it hot? Is it summer? Is there a plate nearby? It constantly tests a prediction system against that observation, right? So that means that we do not live in the universe. We live in our best prediction of the universe. So we create pocket universes in which we live, and we try to match the best pocket universe we can create versus the universe we actually live in. And again, fundamentally, it's necessary, because if we were just to live in the universe, we would wait for the bear to maul us, or at least to see it coming at us. Even when we see the bear coming at us, we're making the prediction that that bear is going to try to kill us. If we did not have that, then there'd be no life. First of all, from just a survival mechanism, we cannot wait for the bear to attack to respond to it, right? So, evolution one. And second of all, and that's the game of entropy I talk about all the time, life is about negating entropy, or at least fighting the creation of entropy. So that's another podcast I made on the subject and everything. But all that to say that the brain is a Bayesian machine, not a deterministic machine. And it matters a lot, because that means that behavior is at the source of everything. That's the idea of embodied cognition, that the brain cannot just absorb things. It needs a body to be able to process data, right? Because it needs to poke at the data coming. It needs to move the eyes. It needs to breathe. It needs movement. And the brain go together. The body and the brain go together. Movement and the body go together. So again, the idea of embodied cognition. So it means that from a deep level, there is no possibility of turning off behavior and training. And I'm not talking psychology, because this is the mistake people make. They think I'm talking about the capacity of someone to, to stick with a training plan or stuff like that. It goes much deeper than the psychology that we understand. So in that sense, if we look at psychoanalysis and psychology and everything, it is still an attempt to take the mind and the body apart and saying that one influences the other, but they are not one. And it is wrong. Behavior cannot be split from performance in that sense. You can't just go to a sports psychologist and talk about performance. You're going to have to act upon it. And this is where the Q training comes in. So I'm going to oversimplify, but if you look at mental issues, they always have three roots. Is you're giving me a 2 when you need a 10. You're giving me a 10 when you need a 2. And you cannot give me a 6. Why do I mean by that? If you look at schizophrenia, you have either a 2, which is, for example, catatonia, where they can't move. So in that case, it's a 0. The 2 would be barely functioning, right? When obviously, sometimes you need to get out of that stage. You will need to create a massive amount of energy, a 10, to address the situation. You give me a 10, which means you freak out every time you need to just deal with the world. So, and then give me a 10 instead of a 2. So for example, even schizophrenia, you are there, there's a source of stress. Schizophrenic, what is called positive symptoms, means they explode into George V is commanding me to kill dragons, and I'm going to charge them on my horse, right? Sorry. So that's a 10 instead of a 2. In the case of anxiety, it'd be simply like you have to deal with an email at work and it gives you a panic attack, right? You have a fight with your boss that is really a 4, right? And then you make it into a 10 that crashes you completely, right? So why is bad to have a 2 on a 10 or 10 on a 2? Because that's the principle of somatic error, is that the prediction and the observation do not match. And that creates a massive amount of problems, as I've discussed in other podcasts, and physiological issues, right? And we're going to see that, for example, with the lactate levels. So the key to not have somatic error is to give me a 4 when a 4 is needed, is to give me a 7 when a 7 is needed, a 10 when a 10 is needed, a 2 when a 2 is needed. The problem starts is when you cannot match prediction and observation, when the world is asking you a specific number and you cannot match that number. You give me something else, right? So my body is asking for, the world is asking for a 4, and I'm going to react maybe with my mind at a 4, but my body's at a 6, or vice versa, stuff like that. This is the source of all issues, really. So when I say you cannot give me a 6, what do I mean by that? I mean that whenever I create a certain amount of stress, so maybe you're good from 1 to 5. You can handle 1 to 5, no problem. You know exactly what it feels. But the second the world asks you a 7, all you can give me is a 10. I've seen that with fighters that are more like the pacing, very technical fighters. When the fight is at a specific technical pace, boom, 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 they're fine. But then the second you press, so you give a 7, the only thing they have is a 10. But then 10 is too much for that fight, so they start to get tired and it starts to mess with their head. Hence the issue, right? And on that subject, it's far more important than we understand, because we're thinking, oh, the guy's giving a 10 instead of 7, he gets tired faster. But there's a play there that is the fundamental key of the Q training is not getting exhausted at 10 just from a physical perspective. He's also exhausted because that trigger that went from 7 to 10 is the fail, right? His sense of self got threatened, and that triggers a massive physiological response way past the normal fatigue that would be given during the fight. This is where the anaerobic threshold comes in, for example. There is no such thing as anaerobic threshold. When we see that spike of lactate is actually triggered by a sense of threat. But it seems there's the sense of threat is everything. It's the same thing as the somatic error. So whenever the somatic error is large, a sense of threat takes place. What do I mean by all this? Is that switch into flight, right? Is that you are from 2 to 5, you're doing fine, you're handling the threats like the boss is coming, everything is fine. But there's that moment where that specific threat, for reasons that are unique to you, right? But there's a specific threat that triggers something and then suddenly go from a 5 to a 10. There's a reaction, right, from you that does not match what the world is asking. The fight with the boss was not that bad, but for whatever reason, there's an argument, there's something in that situation that triggers that fail, that quit, and then from there, boom, the trigger happens and you switch all the way up. What you have to understand when you switch all the way up is that it's not just your mind that goes nuts, because that's what most people think. There's a physiological reaction. Your mind might go nuts actually because of the physiological reaction, because that threat triggered a massive elevation of your lactate levels. This is what we saw. We saw the levels of lactate being, rising for reason that at first glance you would go, there's no need to go that far, right? For example, that's what I talked about in my last podcast. I really hope you cannot hear the sound in the back, because of course, the second I start my podcast, the guy is starting to drill or cut some stuff in the back. Welcome to life. Anyway, like in the last podcast, I was talking about like 30 minutes in the sun for my coach was enough to raise the lactate levels past acidosis. So what it means is that those moments, those fails, will not allow you to train anymore. So for example, for a fighter, it would be like he's doing fine. He needs a 7, but a fear of, go figure what, right? Either people watching, technique breaking down, physical pain, or like maybe physical injury, but not just anywhere. Maybe it's the leg, maybe it's the knee, maybe it's the elbow, maybe it's the nose, like things like this. Boom, trigger something and suddenly you reach acidosis. Not from a physical perspective, but it turns out from a mental perspective, right? At that moment, when you're in acidosis, your body will shut down for very important physiological reasons. So you could see that the fail is in the way of your performance, is the main part in the way of your performance, that most likely you could perform with your exact same body, same levels you have today. You could perform at a much higher rate if you were not touching that fail, right? So first of all, finding what that fail is becomes primordial. And then once you know what that fail is, can we do things in order to have that fail not impact us so much? Because that becomes the key to performance. Because again, I believe that exactly where you are right now, some of the workout you fail not because of your physical capacity, but because they happen to touch that specific fail, right? So identifying them is so important, and that's where the lactate testing comes in. But then once we identify them, how do we deal with that? And so that's what I want to talk today, and this is where the Q training comes in. So a lot of it, if you look, so we have different situations here, but if you see when you start to do a workout and things get hard, the voice starts in your head, right? When you're very good at an exercise and you're cruising at a speed that you know you can maintain, there's no voice in your head. There's actually a great silence. And we're going to talk about this in the next podcast, the silence of the Q training. Because that's going to be the point, is once you are at a certain level, at a certain skill, certain neural output, and you're very confident in all three, there is no voice in your head. You're clear-minded, you're present, and you're killing it, right? And then suddenly you go, weight is heavier, you go a little bit faster, whatever it is, you start to approach the fail, where the energy expenditure is greater, and a voice starts to talk to you. What is that voice? Well, that voice is what matters the most. So I believe that voice is the diva brain starting to talk to you. From an evolution perspective, what we see is that the brain is the latest, things of evolution. It is what uses the most energy. I talked about this time and time again. All the networks in the brain, all that stuff. So the diva brain is what? The diva brain is the most evolved part of your brain, all the cognition system that is there to allow us to survive in society. And if you want to know what I'm talking about on this one, it's called the selfish brain theory. Google it. I'll put some links in the description. And the selfish brain theory says that all energy has to go toward a higher brain function first. That's the way evolution works. And then it's being triggered to let's say the lower functions. There is no doubt that in today's society, the lower functions are the evolution of the physical body. The physical body, there is only one body, but you know what I mean, right? We are in less need of physical prowess, and we're in more need of social prowess, right? Of identifying threat for more social environment more than our physical environment. So that means that the diva brain, right, gets the energy first. Whenever you train, you're starting to require a certain amount of energy. Eventually, as either the weight go up or conditioning or whatever goes up, you're going to start to threaten the amount of energy the diva brain can receive. And that's when the voice starts talking to you, start to go, hey, that one is mine. Why are you getting closer, right? And so that's the problem within the training, in the sense of nothing is forcing you to keep on training. There is no bear chasing you. There's no zombie behind you to make you run faster or longer or whatever. So a training session is a choice. But in a way that presents a problem, in the sense of, from an observation perspective, why do I need to lift a weight again? Why do I need to do that workout? Why do I need to go to the gym? There is no, those reasons rationally, but at that moment, there is no observation from the sensory system to tell you that you need to keep on moving. So that makes the prediction much stronger than the observation. And that's where the diva brain comes in. So as I spend more and more of energy, the diva brain is going to come more and more and say, hey, I want that energy for me, not for you. So how do we fight that? And that's the key of the Q training. So let's talk about that 6, right? That middle, like how to shut up the diva brain, because that's going to come in play for the Disney December and the burner questions. All this will make sense at the end. The Q training is what? The Q training is I'm going to get at a 6, 7. Why? Because I need my body to be at a certain level of intensity, observation, so that it can match the mind. Because again, what we're trying to get you is we're trying to get you to a certain control of behavior. So my mind is, today's world, I'm anxious or whatever, or I'm low, but my mind is at a certain level. My mind can only talk to my body if the two are matching at the same level. Otherwise, we create a somatic error. I can talk about, sexual trauma and stuff like that, sitting in my chair very easily, but my mind and my body cannot talk. Why? Because my mind, if I refer to my past sexual trauma as a kid, will be at a much higher level than my body is. So there's no communication is. So the only way I can deal with it really is to bring the level of physicality at the level of what my mind is at, which is why I think Jiu-Jitsu helped me so much. Because he put me in weird position, right, where I was touching weird places, but at a very high intensity. And at first it was quite something for me, but it allowed me to deal with it, right? Fundamentally, my belief is that your body and your mind have to be at the same number for them to talk. Otherwise, somatic error, they don't talk and nothing is accomplished. Hence why psychoanalysis takes so long. Again, my belief. So I'm going to go on and I'm going to use the Airdyne because that to me is the worst, right? So I'm going to go on the Airdyne for 10 minutes and I'm going to be at 60, which is now 62 for me because I'm making progress, right? And so why 60, 62? Because that's the moment where the stress is high enough that I can't just cruise, right? So as the stress is going up, at first, I want to give a 10. I want my mind to raise past the level that my body is at. And the key was like, no, stay at 60 physically, but spend the least amount of mental energy possible to stay at 60. So that means that my body was going up, my mind was coming down, and then they both meet at 60 and understand exactly that position, and then they can start talking. So why 60? Because if I'm at 55, the diva brain is not being challenged because I'm not spending enough energy physically at 55 to challenge the amount of energy going to the diva brain. At 60, I do. If I were to go to 65, the amount of energy that I would spend physically would threaten the diva brain to the point where it would start talking so loudly that I've already lost the behavior stuff. It's too far into the diva brain for me to be able to talk, right? The diva brain is too loud at that moment. You know what I'm talking about. Can I do 10 minutes at 65? Of course I can. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, but 3 weeks later, I'm going to quit because I'm not gaining anything out of it. So 65 is too fast, too hard, too much energy being spent. So instead, I'm going to be at 60. 60, the diva brain is starting to get challenged, but just a bit. I mean, just like, like you're starting to take energy from me, which means the voice is starting, but it's not telling me to quit yet. It's not telling me to give up. It's not too loud yet. It's just starting to talk, which means at that level, I can tell it to shut up. And that's the key, right? 55 is not talking. And so therefore, there is no talking because the diva brain is not that voice that tells me to quit, is not there yet. 65 is too loud. I can't fight it either. So the key is at 60. Right now, 62, when it starts to talk to me and I get to say, shut up. Why? Because for 10 minutes, my diva brain is like 4 minutes, always at 4 or 5 minutes, where I'm like, okay, you've done what you set out to do, you breathe hard, now you can stop. And I'm like, no, 10 minutes. And from 5 to 10 minutes is that constant talk when the diva brain is trying to pull me out of the Airdyne, and I'm like, no, I'm doing this. So I can remain present within a voice that is trying to tell me to quit, that is there, but it is not making me quit, right? If that makes sense, over the long run. And if you look, that's mostly what the outside world is. You have emails to do, you have a meeting with a boss you don't want to do. So if you look at all the stuff my big thing is procrastination, right? What you're procrastinating against is always the same. It's that stuff that you know you have to do, but you're like, oh, let me do it after. Because it's a 6. If he was a 10, I would raise up and just punch in the face. I'd be saying, but it's not that. It's just a 6. And a 6, you're like, yeah, I'll do it later or whatever. And that's what the Airdyne is for me, is to like put my body at a 6, where the energy is starting to get spent and the diva brain starts talking. And the diva brain that wants to make me quit just to, stay within my inner world. That's what I'm fighting. I'm fighting the diva brain. But again, it cannot be too loud, otherwise you quit. So at 6, 10 minutes every morning, I get to tell my diva brain to shut up. And this has transformed my life. I kid you not. We'll do a podcast with Janina where we'll talk about this, because I realized that the things that were getting in my way was always that voice, always that chatter from the diva brain. And every day for 10 minutes, I get to tell it to shut up. So right at 60, right, 62 now, where it starts to talk, and I'm like, shut up, shut up, shut up. So why 10 minutes? If I say 15, I can feel it's too long. 8 minutes, that's too short. I'm like, I can do 10, right? 6 minutes, I'm just lazy. 10 minutes, I can do 10 minutes. That's okay, it doesn't stress me out. But it's long enough that I have to keep myself on that seat, you know what I mean? And tell myself, no, you don't quit. You do this. Stay with it. No, shut up. And then to the diva brain, no, shut up. I'm doing this. I'm in control, right? And I do that first thing in the morning, and it changes my day every time. Because whenever I face the world, which is usually at 6 or 7, and he throws me something, I can go, no, I stay at 6. I don't give a 10, I don't give a 2. I don't quit, which is a 2. I don't go nuts, which is a 10. I give you what the world is, which is a 6 or a 7. And now that I've done that long enough, 6 weeks, now I know when the world is asking for a 5 or a 6.5 or a 5.2 or whatever, because at least I stop having either a 2 as a response or a 10 as a response. I ended up with the center. And from that center, I can start spreading out, which is a lot better to do than from the extremities. So that's the key of the Q training, right? And I'm talking about the Q-1, just the cardio part, as a behavior set to quiet down the diva brain, because the diva brain is what will take you from fight to flight. That's what we saw on the study where people doing sprints, marathon runners doing sprints, and starting to get into what they call aerobic threshold. It wasn't the physicality of the sprints, it was the challenge to the diva brain that switched them to flight. To not go into flight, you need to challenge the diva brain. The best way to do it is at Q-1. Now, I can apply that also to lifting, the Q training, right? Where I will do sets of lifting, deadlift, whatever you name it. In that case, right now, because Q power training is going to be a lot of deadlift, squats, bench, shoulder pressing, stuff like that. I'm going to apply it the same way, which means I'm going to stay at Q-1. I'm never going to push the reps into the danger zone of either the diva brain bitching too much or fear of injury. Like, that extra rep that you do, and then you finish and you go, ooh, I didn't like that. Well, I didn't like that. Some of you are fine. Some others, depending on the body part, you might not like. So for example, ooh, I feel that and it's in my mid back, I don't give a shit. It's in my neck, it doesn't bother me too much. My lower back, especially in the right, I start to go, ooh, right. So maybe for you it's the neck or whatever, but there's that extra rep that can actually take you straight to flight. And that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. We cannot go to flight, right? So the key again is to identify that in your training, and then we're going to stay away from either the cognition, the technique, or the physical pain, or the social aspect, whatever it is. We are not going to go into flight, right? Because into flight means the diva brain wins, and it can never win. So what we do, even with the lifting, is we fight the diva brain. We can do it with lifting, we can do it with conditioning, EMOMs versus AMRAPs, I'll do a podcast on that. We can do it through, so lifting, conditioning, anything really doesn't matter. The point is to fight the diva brain, is to shield ourselves from the diva brain too strong that it takes us to flight all the time. And if you see, that's mostly with mental issue what we see. So going back to the 2 versus 10, you give me a 2 when you need a 10. What do I mean by that? You're having a fight, a physical fight or whatever, and you much rather go, no, I'm calm, and I'm like this. Bullshit, you can't do that. You can't namaste the bear way. That's not true. Like, you can't do that. Sometimes the world requires you to give you another answer than a 2, which is always what I talked about, what was my problem with people trying to go parasympathetic for everything. I'm like, but sometimes you need to go sympathetic. You can't just stay in that flow state all the time. Sometimes you require to fight. If a guy comes and slaps your wife, right, or your kid, well, guess what? You can't just, hey, well, let's talk about it. I mean, I guess you can, but it's not always what is required. Sometimes the world requires more than a 2. And so that's why we see in depression, really. Depression is a freeze mode, right? Is your brain going like, ooh, let's take a breath here and everything. And sometimes, no, you don't take a breath. You go deal with the stuff, right? Sometimes you got to jump. Depression is giving me a 2 whenever a 10 or any other number is required. When all your reactions are like calm, reset, don't, like take a breather, don't take an action. That's really what depression is, right? So whenever you see people pacing, it's like they have a workout requires an 8 and they're giving you a 4. That's pacing. That means they're on the low side. And we see that on the lactate levels, where people are very low levels of lactate when they wake up, when they go to bed, stuff like that. It means that their body is not capable of recognizing threats anymore, right? And so there can be different reasons as to why on that one, but one of the big one is the crash. It's like everything becomes a threat, which means eventually nothing is a threat, right? And then the sense of self gets pummeled, because now if nothing is a threat, you have problems like identifying what is me versus what is not me. Last podcast, body as an object versus body as a subject. You run into major issues by thinking that way. But that's what the core of depression is I'm going to give a 2 for whatever it is that the world gives me. We get catatonia of schizophrenia, right? So you take bipolar people when they're depressed. It's just there's no answer to the world really, and that's always been my position about what depression is. So if everything you give me is a 2, but I need more, of course Q training is going to work. But then we're going to go on the side. What if that's a 2? Q training will be a 6. What is a 10 then? The 10 is the burner question. And so that's the difference between the Q training and the burner question. Is the Q training is designed to make you deal with the world. The burner question is designed to make you deal with yourself. Why? Because when you have a 10, that means your sense of self was challenged by the world and you need to answer in kind, which means you need to blast. To blast in a training session like the burner question, and that's why I used it for, is because there is no impetus to continue to push that sled, because after all, there is no bear, there is no zombie. That means you're gonna have to create that zombie, you're gonna have to create that bear. And that bear is a simple question. What do you want out of yourself? That means that you're gonna have to create a threat, the bear, so big about what you want out of yourself, that it acts as the bear, that it acts as the confirmation, as the observation from the world to keep you pushing that sled. And that's fundamentally what the burner question is. It's the way to go, what do I want out of myself? And that's what I did on that parking lot every week, is I put a gun to my head. Not physically, obviously, but it's really what this was. I put a gun to my head on a threat to the sense of self, and I'm like, all right, I'm gonna go at the end of that parking lot, because at that time in my life, I needed to know what I wanted out of my life, out of me, really. And so every time I got on the sled, I threatened my sense of self. And it was a simple thing for me. It was like, if you don't make it in the parking lot, you're gonna have to look at yourself in the mirror tomorrow morning knowing you failed yourself. And that's a thought. That was a gun to my head. Because for many things, for me, you always have a choice. You can die. So, and that's the bottom argument really, is you always have a choice. You can die. And that's the way I looked at it on that parking lot. It was like, you're gonna finish, or you have a choice, you can die. But what you're not going to do is not finish and look at yourself in the mirror tomorrow morning knowing you failed yourself. Like that was not going to happen. So every week it was a question that I asked myself, the gun that I put to my head, going like, you're going to pull the trigger or no? Are you going to quit? Is that what you want of yourself? Is that what's going to happen to you? Are you going to quit? And I have a long history of that. You know, my brother committed suicide. I had a difficult childhood, let's say. So it was that gun to my head. It's like, what do I want out of myself? But you have to understand, that's what the burner question was. It was finding a 10, right? Because to me, and I changed the world into asking me for a 10. And for me, that was that gun to my head. But if you look, that's literally what it was, because he was challenging my sense of self to a degree that the bear was coming. And then so I would push that sled. But you also have to understand, it took me 2 hours to recover, 3 hours every time. Like my levels of lactate, you can imagine, were being pushed to the max, and then I would push past that. I'd be curious to know what the levels were back then. But so it was not enough to do that. Like I would spend 2-3 hours, because I would do it on Saturday. The rest of the day was meant to rebuild my sense of self, right? I would destroy it every Saturday to make it better. And then I would spend the next 3 hours. I'm very big, obviously, in my inner world. And I'm a student of philosophy, where I would rebuild myself for the next 3 hours. So you have to understand that, because if you do a burner question and do not, let's say you are as successful as doing the burner question as I was, but you do not spend the next 3 hours rebuilding your sense of self, rebuilding yourself, you'll crash. You'll do it 3 times and then you'll be done, and it'll give you a massive depression, because the whole system will be like, we're not doing that, right? So that was the importance of the burner question. But the burner question is really, what do I want out of myself? Whereas the Q training is, how do I want to react to the world? The Q training you use to be able to identify your center, your 6. That when the world stresses you out, how will you respond? right? When the voice starts talking, how will you respond? If the voice is as loud as a 10, there's only one way to respond is you got to go for it, right? Which most people cannot do, so it makes them crash. Somatic error. But the Q training is like, all right, the world wants a 6 or a 7, give it a 6 or a 7, not a 2, not a 10, right? So if you just do burn the questions, then you'll notice everything is a 10 because that's how you're training. And so I had that issue too, by the way, at that time. It's like now, any threat, any time the energy level goes up past a certain point, I give a 10. Because that's literally what I trained myself to do. So it screwed me over completely with Jiu-Jitsu, where I could not do Jiu-Jitsu anymore. Because every time the fight got hard, I would give a 10. But then I'm done in a minute. Because on top of it, now there's a serious threat coming to me, right? That was far more on the sense of self. I knew I could control the sled. I knew I could stop at any moment. I just chose not to. But the sled was not scaring me anymore. I'm doing Jiu-Jitsu, there's a guy trying to take my head off. That's an entirely different concept, right? And there's people watching, and then I can get hurt. I can hurt my elbow like I did so many times. And people are watching. And some of those triggers would take me way too far in the sense of self and just would crash me completely. And so it made me quit Jiu-Jitsu because I did not have that 6. I did not have Q training. Now that I have it, I'm going back to Jiu-Jitsu, and the world is different, right? So that's the difference between the Q training and then the burn the question. The question is answering a simple question: what do I want out of myself? The Q training is answering the simple question: is what do I want out of the world? That's the difference, right? And so what is Disney December? Well, Disney December was to be at a 2. Like people are very, very anxious, and sometimes they'll be at a 25 millimole, like levels of lactate just have a fail. How do I bring myself down? That's what the Disney December was for, was to actually allow you to be at a 2, stay at a 2. So we create a world that is a 2. How do we do that? We put the Disney music, so then suddenly the sound, the high frequency sound promotes safety. The world is at a 2. We do nasal breathing, none of the sympathetic triggers. We are at a 2. We go at a pace that is not too slow but not too fast, so we don't create a sympathetic response. The world is at a 2. So that's what we did with the Disney December, is we created a 2 and we allow you to stay at a 2 for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, so that you could talk to yourself, right? Your body is at a 2, your mind is at a 2, and now you get to talk, and you get almost into that theta brain wave where there's a silence. And in that silence, you get to talk to yourself. In a way, when I was doing Burn the Question, there was a silence there too, hence the term Burn the Questions. Is when I was at 10, my body was at 10, my mind was at 10, there was a silence there. When I'm doing the Q training, my body's at 6, my mind is at a 6, there's a silence there. The silence exists when your body and your mind are at the same level and they get to talk. And that's what mental health is that silence. Problem starts when the silence is broken, when the chaos starts. And the chaos is because you're reacting at a 2 when a 10 is needed. So prediction observation, you reacted at a 10 when a 2 is needed. And you cannot give me a 6. That's fundamentally the nature of mental health issue, of a lack of mental health, is prediction observation do not match. What the world is requiring of you, or what you're requiring of yourself, is not matching prediction versus observation, right? And so, is Disney December necessary? Yes, in specific situations where your mind and your body have to be at a 2. Can Burn the Question work well? Of course they did. They saved me for years. But you have to understand, your body and your mind have to be at a 10 for Burn the Questions. I've seen too many people crashing themselves doing Burn the Questions because their mind would be at a 10, but their body wouldn't. They would not push the sled as hard as was required. So what you saw really is them trying to do it at an 8. Right? They were on an 8, physically, and then maybe they get like a 6, 7 mentally, but then over time it would crash them, right? Because that's way too much energy being spent. And then the voice which keep yapping in their ear, and that voice is asking, why are we doing this? There is no bear, there is no zombie, can we please stop? Can we please stop? Can we please stop? And eventually that voice is going to win. That voice is part of a system that is far more evolved and will make you stop. The only way to win the Burn the Question is to get the silence, is to make that voice shut up. It requires a great strength of mind to make that voice stop. We can train that, and the best way to train it is the Q training. And so that's why I end up doing those 10 minutes on the Erdine every morning, because it is my way of shutting up the voice. I can shut it up at 2, I can shut it up at 10. What I could not do is shut it up at like a 7. That was really my issue, and that's why quitting jiu-jitsu, that's why I'm trying to turn pro into strongman, like the voice started to get there and all, and then I could never shut it up. Now I can. Why? Because I'm doing that on a regular basis every day for 10 minutes on that Erdine. Why the Erdine? Because that's what causes me the most stress. So I know exactly what the number is when the voice starts talking, and then I'm like, no, shut up. No, shut up. That's literally the conversation. I'm like, no, I'm not quitting. Yes, I'm doing this for 10 minutes. I can do 10 minutes. It's not the end of the world, right? It's not 15 minutes. That sounds long. It's not 6 minutes. That's lazy. It's 10 minutes. I can do 10 minutes. So I'm going to do 10 minutes, and I start. And of course, minute 4, I'm like, no, stay on it. So I set my day like that, right? I get what I want out of the world. And that has changed everything for me. Changed everything for my one-on-ones, changed everything for Jenny and I. There's a silence in Q training that is, to me, the key to mental health. And so this is my work. This is what I'm going to talk more and more. This is probably what a lot of the podcasts are going to be about, is the importance of Q training. I wanted to establish the difference between Q training and burn the questions. And they all matter. It just depends what do you need. If you're always at a 10, yeah, you need to do Disney December. If you're on the downside, then Disney December will just crash you, because then it will give you that illusion that a 2 is a good idea. Sometimes a 2 is a good idea. But if the world is asking you for something more than a 2, then it's not a good idea to do Disney December, right? So it depends of your situation. Where are you? What do you want? All that stuff. If you do burn the questions, but you can't face yourself in there, then all it's going to do is crash you. So it would not be a good thing either. The Q training is what gives us a center, what allows us to move the center forward, right? So that's the Q training will allow us to find our own baseline, right? Maybe you want a higher baseline. You're at a 2. You want a baseline at a 5, at a 6. How do we do that? Through the Q training, your baseline is too high. How do we lower it if that's what you want? Q training, because then that, if I'm always at an 8, that means I go on the Erdine and I'm like, oh, I can do this. And then I start blasting. Yeah, but you're just enduring. You're just saying, I can do this. Of course you can. That's not the point. The point is, can you do it whilst the voice is not speaking? So if you have to be an 8, then I'm going to get you maybe at a 7 and then start to bring you down toward the baseline that works better for you. Same way the other way. If I get on it and then, I'm doing a 56 and I can't seem to get to a 60, that means I'm down that day. Usually also emotional mapping, but it also has to do with the hamstrings. I know now to go like, get the hamstrings to keep moving. So the first 3 minutes are hard, but give me a 60, not a 56, a 60, come on. But without my mind jumping to a 10, if that makes sense, right? And that's the key, is I can't go to 60 on the Erdine while my mind jumps at 10. My mind has to stay at a 6. Move yourself faster, stay at a 6, if that makes sense. Cool? Thank you, guys.